Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the trickle-down effect from the lawless presidency of Donald Trump, who has valorized insurrectionists and pardoned scammers and fraudsters to the extent that his private army of ICE thugs have been given immunity to break the law. Joining us to discuss how ICE and CBP are undermining professional policing in this country and undoing decades of engagement of police in better serving minority communities is Tom Nolan, who was a City of Boston police officer for 27 years, his last 10 years as a uniformed lieutenant and shift commander in the patrol division. He has been Associate Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Boston University, the State University of New York at Plattsburgh, Merrimack College, and Emmanuel College. He was a senior policy advisor at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in Washington, D.C., and is the author of Perilous Policing, Criminal Justice in Marginalized Communities. Then we'll explore similarities between Hitler's brown shirts and Trump's ICE and speak with Benjamin Carter Hett, a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of City University of New York. He's the author of Burning the Reichstag, Crossing Hitler, Death in the Tiergarten, and The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, How Hitler Took the World into War. His latest book is The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, The Power of Grievance, What History Reveals About Authoritarianism's Animating Force. Then finally we'll assess the possibility of a renewed U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran now that the, quote, Armada Trump sent to the region is in place, and speak with Nicholas Heras, Senior Director for Strategy and Innovation at the New Lines Institute, and the former Middle East Security Program Manager at the Institute for the Study of War, where he was Director of Government Relations responsible for Russia and Eurasia. From 2016 to 2017, Nicholas served as the 10th First Lieutenant Andrew J. Basovich Jr. USA Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he has conducted an extensive study on Iran's proxies in the Middle East for the National Defense University. And joining us now, Tom Nolan, who was a City of Boston police officer for 27 years, his last 10 years as a uniformed lieutenant and shift commander in the patrol division. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tom Nolan.
Thanks for having me.
So, Tom, as a result of the killing of a second American citizen, Alex Pretty, which we all seen multiple videos of, and it contradicts, of course, exactly what Kristi Noem and DHS have been saying, what happened. So they have a credibility problem. They're sending the border czar, Tom Homan, to Minneapolis this evening to try and sort things out. But in general, are the activities of ICE, which we've all seen on television now for weeks, are they undermining the broader public respect for police in general? In other words, police are to protect and serve, not to kill innocent American citizens.
Yeah, I think absolutely they are undermining what the police have sought to establish over the last several decades, going back to the 1990s, in community policing initiatives. These initiatives have established partnerships with people in the communities that are now being ruptured and undermined by the overwhelming response of ICE. So take Minneapolis for an example. You've got about 600 Minneapolis police officers who are responsible for providing police services in that city. And you've now had an overwhelming influx of 3,000 plus ICE agents, Customs and Border Protection agents, Border Patrol officers who've descended on the city and who are obviously acting out in a lawless fashion and putting the police in an impossible situation, because you've got people in the community who are looking to the Minneapolis Police Department. And it's the same in Chicago. It's the same in Portland, Maine, and Lewiston, Maine. We're seeing that now, where people are looking to their police departments to intervene and to assist them and to protect them ultimately. And we're seeing that the police are reluctant to become involved and be put in the middle. So only recently, I think, in the last couple of days since the shooting death of Alex Preddy in Minneapolis, and prior to that, the shooting of Renee Good. I think now we're beginning to see a groundswell of people calling for the state prosecution of ICE agents who are acting lawlessly. So in Hennepin County, for example, and that's Minneapolis, St. Paul, that district attorney has commenced an investigation, a criminal investigation of the officers, agents responsible for these two shooting deaths, and has had subpoenas issued and begun to collect evidence, even though that is being thwarted by DHS officials. I think the foundation is being laid for a potential future prosecution of these folks who are involved in this lawless kind of violence.
Well, apparently, we've seen a lot of ICE agents smashing windows and dragging people out of cars. Apparently, the police in Minneapolis are overwhelmed with 911 calls because when they haul people out of these cars, they quite often leave the car in the middle of the street or sometimes in gear. And then, citizens are calling the police, because cars are blocking traffic, etc. So ICE is actually making policing in Minneapolis so much more difficult. And as you point out, the ratio of local police to the federal outside forces is pretty extraordinary.
And what we're seeing with ICE and CBP and the Border Patrol, for your example, the smashing of the car windows, this is something that is fundamentally anathema to normal police protocol and procedure in their training. In my 27 years as a Boston police officer, I don't believe I've ever seen a police officer smash a window of a vehicle and reach in and drag someone out of the car. And certainly leaving the car, we've seen reports of, as you mentioned, cars being left in gear with the engine running and the people are simply dragged off and there's no provision made to remove the vehicle. So they are complicating certainly normal police operating procedures. And the ways that we've seen, for example, these federal agents and officers engaging protesters. This is something that they historically have had no role in confronting people who are engaging in constitutionally protected activity and engaging in acts of civil disobedience. This is normally the province of state, county, local police officers, on rare occasions, perhaps the National Guard, but we haven't seen Customs and Border Protection officers, Border Patrol officers, ICE agents engaging in crowd control. That's not something that they have any training for. That's obvious what we're seeing with them hitting people with chemical agents. I mean, the shooting death of Alex Petit was preceded by his attempting to intervene when one of these agents or officers hit a woman with a chemical agent spray and knocked her to the ground, and then hit Mr. Preddy with a chemical agent. And this is something that ordinarily police engaging with protesters have strict training and protocols, procedures that govern the circumstances, even in many jurisdictions, laws and court orders that govern the circumstances under which, for example, chemical agents can be used against protesters. So we're seeing this kind of Wild West lawlessness where video after video that we're seeing where ICE agents, CBP, and Border Patrol are just randomly hitting people, knocking them to the ground, smashing car windows, dragging them out into the street. And this is just complete when police officers, actual police officers, see this kind of activity, and they know that if they were to even contemplate engaging in such behavior, that they would be sanctioned and disciplined and possibly even terminated for engaging in this kind of behavior. And yet they're seeing federal officials doing what they are prohibited by policy from doing, and there's little that the police themselves can do about it.
Well, let's talk about what the police could possibly do, Tom. I mean, could the police chiefs in this country, I assume they have some kind of organization. Could they step up and make some kind of public statement now about this behavior? Because as I suggested earlier, and I think you agree with me, ICE and Border Patrol and Miller and Nome and the whole crew, they're hurting the image of police. And after all this work that's been done in community policing, if that's all being undone, and minority communities in this country are cowering and afraid to, leave their homes, and apparently in Minneapolis, a lot of these volunteers, like Alex Petty and Renee Good, they're bringing food to people who are locked in because they're afraid to leave their homes. Yep. So it's a 1-2 punch. Policing itself is being hurt in terms of its credibility and decency, and at the same time, the work done to bring minority communities into a sense of community and safety, that's being undone as well.
So I think we've seen, for example, the chief in Minneapolis, I believe his name is O'Hara, is walking a fine line, and he is making public statements where he is not only expressing the frustration that he feels and the officers in his department, but the objection to a strenuous objection and a strident objection to what's going on in his city. And I think that's something that's shared with police chiefs across the country. But they're in a very difficult bind because, and particularly, just on a practical matter, being outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned, and out-resourced. And again, the smaller police departments being dwarfed by this overwhelming federal presence. It's something that, and keep in mind too that the federal agents and officials who are coming into these cities across the United States know nothing about the people who live there. The chiefs and the departments that they lead are an integral part of the communities they police, and so they feel compassion towards what the people are enduring. And I'm sure a level of frustration that they're unable to do what they believe their jobs consist of, which is protecting the communities and to keep people safe. And so when they can't keep the people safe who are legitimately protesting, it's something that is no doubt a vexing problem for police administrators and for police chiefs. The question that remains going forward is, what direction should police departments take? Now, I would be someone who would probably advocate for some kind of an intervention. And I think that has to start with prosecutors. So prosecutors are ultimately responsible, and these are elected they are called district attorneys, they're called county attorneys, but they exist in counties throughout the United States, and those are the public officials who are elected and whose responsibility it is to determine whether or not actions are criminal and prosecutable. And so county attorneys, district attorneys could begin to consider conveying the message to police officials that we will move forward with criminal prosecutions for these offenses. And we're not just talking about the 2 murders that occurred in Minneapolis, but there are other crimes that are being perpetrated on people who are engaging in lawful protest. We're talking about the smashing of the car windows and dragging people out of their vehicles. I mean, certainly if this were done by a regular police officer, this would be reported. It would be investigated. The behavior would be, the incident would be evaluated as to the propriety of the use of this type of force. And a determination would be made as the result that may result in disciplinary action. So it's something that if like in Hennepin County, St. Paul, Minneapolis, if that county attorney is beginning to commence the process of conducting a criminal investigation and conveying the message to police in Minneapolis that we will proceed with a criminal investigation with the possible outcome of a prosecution of federal officials, in spite of the people that you name, Homan, Bovino, and Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem and these folks who are gaslighting the American public and threatening people with people being recorded who are in their license plate numbers being taken, who are engaging in constitutionally protected activity and protesting in the streets. So it's a chilling time, I think, for police officials and for police officers, for line officers who are out responding to these 911 calls and who are feeling a sense of frustration that may even border on helplessness when they're asked by people who have been the victims in many situations of crimes. What the police ordinarily could and should do is being stymied and frustrated and thwarted by federal officials who seem to be hell-bent on sowing chaos and disorder and just, behaving violently toward people. And we see it repeatedly. And if it's not somehow frustrated, if the federal officials aren't stopped in their tracks, we're going to see this continue and more lives are going to be lost, unfortunately.
But my understanding, Tom, when there's an officer-involved shooting, is that police departments across the country take it seriously, and they don't pile on and blame the victim and discredit the victim, or even the case of Renee Good, her spouse. This seems to be the opposite that's happening with ICE and the Trump administration, and particularly the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche. They're basically, right out of the gate, exonerating ICE, blaming the victim, and in many cases, trashing the victim. They've done that with Alex Petty. They've called them domestic terrorists. They did the same thing with Renee Good. What's your understanding of the difference between how police departments handle officer-involved shootings and what the Trump administration is doing vis-a-vis ICE in Minneapolis?
Well, officer-involved shooting incidents are taken very seriously by police departments, and they have uniformly established a strict protocol in response to incidents where police officers use deadly force. So an officer-involved shooting in which an individual is killed, and it's typical of the response, and it's somewhat uniform across the spectrum of there's 18,000 different police departments in the United States. But typically they send a specially trained team out that likely will include a member of the district attorney or county prosecutor's office to evaluate the propriety and the reasonableness of the use of this type of force. It's typically a lengthy investigation. And what happens in police departments when situations like this occur, and they do with some degree of regularity. The police in the United States typically, on average, use deadly force over 1,000 times a year. But what we see in police agencies, in county sheriff's departments, in state police agencies, when this type of an incident occurs, is the chief executive officer of the organization, if that is a colonel superintendent or a police chief, will make an immediate public statement acknowledging the loss, expressing typically sympathy to the decedent, the person who was killed by the police and his or her family, and assuring the public that a thorough, rigorous, impartial investigation will commence, and that ultimately a determination will be made whether or not this particular use of deadly force was deemed to be lawful and appropriate and reasonable. What we're not seeing at the federal level is any kind of an acknowledgement. In fact, with Renee Good, we were told that there will be no investigation conducted and that the officer was immediately exonerated without any investigation having taken place. Somehow, 3 weeks later, with Alex Petty's shooting death, arguably a murder, we're seeing Greg Bovino saying that this is all going to be investigated. So I don't know what changed over the course of 3 weeks. The circumstances are strikingly similar in each of these two shooting deaths, but we're seeing a departure from commonly accepted protocol. And I think this is particularly upsetting to people when you have high officials in the government who aren't at the scene, haven't been briefed, haven't examined any type of evidence, no crime scene analysis, no forensic evidence being looked at, oftentimes within a half an hour, 45 minutes. Someone at the federal level, far removed from the scene, is making a pronouncement that this is a justified situation. And then to characterize the people who have been killed as domestic terrorists. And in the case of Renee Good, the Justice Department, Department of Justice, initiated a criminal investigation on her wife for some kind of complicity in domestic terrorist related activities. It's just gaslighting the public. And this is what is causing people to be angry and outraged, is being asked not to believe what you see with your own eyes in the many dozens of different video depictions of the same scenario. Don't believe any of that. Believe what we're telling you, and that these are bad people who deserve the fate that they met.
So just in closing then, Tom, I must say that looking at the video of Alex Petty being sprayed in the face, and we've seen it with others as well, with chemical sprays, and in the case of Alex Petty, he was coming to the rescue of a woman who was being sprayed in the face and had been knocked down by the Border Patrol officers. It sort of reminds me of the footage we saw live on January the 6th of 2021 when the Capitol was stormed and bear spray and spray was being used against police. And I'm just wondering whether the problem lies at the top, in the sense that this Trump administration has valorized those people who attacked the police. They've all been pardoned, and many of them, apparently some have even joined ICE. And the general attitude that President Trump himself seems to have to the law is pretty, well, lawless, I guess, in many ways. He's pardoning all kinds of fraudsters at the moment for reasons which are completely mystifying. So do you think that we have a problem with the President of the United States in terms of maybe having been schooled by Roy Cohn, who was the mob lawyer, that maybe our president really doesn't, at the end of the day, ultimately respect the law, and he only seems to respect his personal privilege and power?
Well, I think there's no question that this president has total disregard for legal constraints in the law. But the message that's being delivered to officers and agents of ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and the Border Patrol, we've had the vice president, for example, saying that they enjoy total immunity. We have the assistant chief of staff, Stephen Miller, saying the same thing, that these officers have total immunity, giving them the not tacit message, explicit message, that you have carte blanche to do whatever you see fit to do in enforcing immigration laws. And when we hear these goons being described as patriots and heroes, they're neither of those things. And we hear this repeatedly. We hear Carolyn Levitt describing them as patriots and heroes. We hear Kristi Noem describing these people as patriots and heroes. And they're out going after criminal aliens and rapists and murderers and drug dealers. They're doing nothing of the sort. They're out in the mission, whatever it was initially, to remove the worst of the worst from our communities, people who are in the country illegally and who are committing crimes, has morphed into this confrontation with people who are protesting their activities. And so that seems to be the bulk of what these agents and officers from the federal government, from DHS, are occupied with, is confronting protesters violently using weapons. I mean, just for an example, if a police officer were to use a pepper spray weapon or a non-lethal weapon like a taser, for example, that's something that would need to be documented. It would be investigated. Each incident of this, if you hit someone with pepper spray, you've got to file a written report on why you would have done that, what the justification was, what the circumstances of the incident were. It's going to be evaluated by a supervisor, and it's going to be sent up the chain of command and have multiple levels of review and approval or disapproval. We're not seeing any of that. These agents are just randomly shooting at people, hitting people with chemical agents, and I suspect that there's no reporting being done on any of this. There's no accountability with it. So I think that when we begin to see potential prosecutions of these line level agents and officers, CBP, Border Patrol, ICE, who've received the message that you can do anything you want to do and you won't be held to any accountability for it, if and when, and hopefully soon, when local district attorneys begin prosecutions, criminal prosecutions of these officers and agents for violating state laws, that will send a different message to ICE, CBP, and Border Patrol that you do not enjoy complete immunity, that you are criminally liable at the state level, or you may be tried and convicted for engaging people in this lawless kind of violence that we see repeatedly.
Well, Tom Nolan, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Tom Nolan, who was a City of Boston police officer for 27 years, his last 10 years as a uniformed lieutenant and shift commander in the patrol division. He has been a professor in criminology and criminal justice at Boston University, the State University of New York at Plattsburgh, Merrimack College, and Emmanuel College, and he was a senior policy advisor at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in Washington, D.C., and is the author of Perilous Policing, Criminal Justice in Marginalized Communities. We're going to take a brief station break and back exploring similarities between Hitler's brown shirts and Trump's ICE.
On this side of the law, on that side of the law, who is right, who is wrong, who is for and who's against the law? Well, you see, I didn't really mean you any harm, but I simply couldn't make it on the farm. When the land won't give a lot, you gotta do with what you got.
And joining us now is Benjamin Carter Hett, a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's the author of Burning the Reichstag, Crossing Hitler, Death in the Tiergarten, and The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, How Hitler Took the World to War. His latest book is The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, The Power of Grievance, What History Reveals About Authoritarianism's Animating Force. Welcome to Background Briefing, Benjamin Carter Hett.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you.
Well, I'm not particularly happy, Ben, because of what's happening in Minneapolis and around the country. And I think a lot of Americans are quite shocked by the second murder of an American citizen by ICE. And the most disturbing part of it is, I don't know whether you saw Kristi Noem's press conference shortly after the victim was murdered by Border Patrol officers in Minneapolis. But it was completely... Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I've been on the road in the past 10 days or so, so I've sort of been keeping up with the news, but only sort of.
Right. Well, what is so disturbing about what she said? She just absolutely lied brazenly, cynically, and in a very sick way, blamed the victim, told us stuff that simply didn't happen. Anybody that saw the many videos that have come out know what happened, and it had nothing to do with what she was saying. But she was basically trashing the victim, valorizing the murderers, and blaming the Democrats. And it felt like somehow or other we're back in the 1930s in Germany, where the brown shirts are given license to go out and beat up and kill people, and the government is telling you that they're the heroes and that the victims are the villains.
Yes. So there have been a lot of these comparisons made lately. A good friend of mine, actually, named Daniel Siemens, who's a very fine historian and probably the leading historian now on Hitler's brown shirts, wrote a piece about this for the Toronto Globe and Mail, published, I think, sometime in the past week. There definitely are some parallels. There are also, I think, some important distinctions. So, I think it's a bit of a mixture, which is not in any way to say, I mean, I agree with you completely about the horrors of this and the utterly inexcusable nature of what's happening. There's some factual similarities and differences, I think, to the Nazi case.
Well, let's go through them then, if you don't mind, Ben.
Sure. So first of all, I think to your point that in Hitler's first year in power, in particular, basically through 1933 and into 1934, the brown shirts were pretty much authorized and licensed to roam through the streets of German cities and attack and kill whoever they wanted with more or less total impunity. As a matter of fact, for some research I was doing some years ago, I actually worked through a bunch of files, legal files where cases were opened against brown shirts for assaults or homicides, and they were all, dismissed. So there was something close to what the Trump administration people have been saying lately about legal immunity for ICE. That kind of applied to the brown shirts. And the character of the violence was somewhat similar, in that it was kind of, it was slightly random street violence, although not random in the sense that the brown shirts were targeting particular people that they deemed to be enemies. For them, of course, anyone they thought was Jewish, but also people that were political opponents of them. In many cases, this was very kind of intimate neighborhood violence, and the local brown shirts would know who the local communist activists were. So they would find them and target them, often beat them, kill them, torture them, that kind of thing. So in that sense, there definitely is a parallel. There's a very drastic difference in scale, though, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. To give you an idea, so in the course of 1933 and 34, there were between 3 and 4 million, mostly young men, in the brown shirts. That's out of a country with a population of around, I believe, 66 million. So if you kind of run the math on that, that's just a vastly, proportionately vastly larger entity than ICE, even with all of the sort of beefing up that ICE has been doing with the greater funding and so on. It's just tiny compared to the brown shirts. So that also, of course, has an effect on the scale of the violence that it can mete out. It's terrible in Minneapolis right now, not much anywhere else. Who knows what's coming, but it's not the same scale as what Germany saw in 1933 and 1934.
But you mentioned that the brown shirts targeted the communists. Stephen Miller, who really runs DHS and who many people think is the deputy or if not the co-president, he has so much power and influence in this administration, it's extraordinary, much more so than the vice president apparently. And he basically runs DHS, and he probably wrote the script for Kristi Noem's appalling press conference after the murder of Alex Petty. So he thinks, and he said many, many times, that about half of the country, anybody that's voted Democrat, are a bunch of communists. He says it all the time.
Yeah, which of course is beyond ridiculous. I mean, in Nazi Germany, well, in the early years anyway, there really were literal communists. The Communist Party was a party that drew a substantial chunk of the vote, around 12% or so, in 1932 and 1933. So there were millions of Germans who voted communist and or were activists for the Communist Party and its various formations. So that was a literally true thing. In the United States today, the number of people that you could actually say were literally communist is, of course, minuscule. So that's been fairly typical right-wing and far right-wing rhetoric since, at least the beginnings of the Cold War. To call people who are liberals, to call them communists in some effort to rhetorically tarnish them. I mean, that's a sort of standard move. So it's not too shocking, I think, that Miller makes that kind of move.
So, Benjamin Carter Hett, obviously one doesn't want to overdo the Nazi analogies because the word fascist is thrown around a lot, sometimes loosely and irresponsibly. But I think the more that we watch what Trump is doing, the more that he says what he says and believes what he believes and makes it clear where he stands, this administration, with these loyalists like Bondi and the Todd Blanche and Kash Patel having taken over law enforcement and essentially becoming, the DOJ is now Trump's private law firm, they are acting in an incredibly lawless manner across the board. And they're telling us that they're in charge and you have to accept what they do. For example, on the immigration issue, when people lawfully show up for hearings before immigration judges, they're being arrested by ICE, who lay in wait for them. And if an immigration judge does the right thing, they fire him. They fired hundreds of immigration judges. So they're acting in an incredibly lawless manner, and little surprise that we don't know exactly what, they've whispered in the ears of ICE members, what Stephen Miller and Christian Omer's actually told them, privately. This is what you can get away with. Is that what's going on here? Because you get the feeling that these ICE thugs have basically, somebody's told them, don't worry about it, we got your back, and you can do anything you want.
Oh, I have no doubt they've been told this. And I mean, it's been said pretty much publicly, and God only knows what is told to them privately. But, I've always been reluctant actually to use the word fascist in a comparison with Trump and his people. I must say I'm becoming less reluctant to use it. I would put it like this, Ian. I think they are attempting to be fascists. I think there's now zero doubt about this. Everything that's been happening in the last, few weeks, especially the horrible violence in Minneapolis, the murders, the just shameful murders of innocent people, and the whole Greenland thing and everything else. I mean, I could quibble, there's a lot of academic quibbles I could make about the use of the term fascism, but what the heck? Yes, they're trying to be fascist. I would also say, though, and this is another thing that goes back to, I think, the distinctions between us right now and 1933 in Germany. There was nothing ever even remotely in Germany like the kind of pushback that is happening from regular people in Minneapolis. And I have found it quite inspiring to read about the kind of spontaneous networks that have sprung up, that people have formed to, track ICE and try and get in their way and try and defend people and stop them. There's just zero parallel to that in Germany. And I think this speaks to something important about the United States. And this speaks to why I say Trump and his people are trying to be fascists. And that is that I think they're going to fail in the sense of getting the kind of control that Hitler had of Germany, because I do not think the American people will stand for it. I think we see this in Minneapolis. I think we'll see it anywhere else. I think the administration is vaguely starting to understand this. I just actually, before we started talking, I saw a headline about Trump said he had a, quote, good call, unquote, with Governor Walz today, which probably means he says that kind of thing when he's about to back away from something. So, I think they know on some level how bad the public relations aspects of this is. And I don't, to say that almost feels like I'm trivializing the horrible murders, which I'm not trying to do, but on the level that Trump and his people understand things, they understand that this is making them look very bad. And it's going to really hurt the Republicans in the midterms. And so there are constraints on what these people can do that weren't on what Hitler could do in 1933. And I think that we've seen with the Greenland thing, there are constraints on what Trump can do in foreign policy, as well as there are constraints on what he can do domestically. Maybe not the constraints that the founding fathers thought they'd put in the Constitution, but they are constraints that are there nonetheless, kind of in the realities of American and international society.
Well, along with these brave citizens in Minneapolis standing up against ICE, using their iPhones. I mean, you literally have to also praise the existence of the iPhone, because it's turned out to be so important. And even in the earlier murder, which we saw on live TV of George Floyd, which happened, quite near where the murder of Rene Good happened, and also Alex Preddy. And Alex Preddy, what did he have in his hand? He didn't have a gun in his hand, for God's sake. He had an iPhone.
He had a phone. Yes, absolutely.
Right. And he documented.
Well, So, to sort of sum up where I think we are on this, I would say the Trump administration is definitely trying to be a fascist regime, both domestically and in foreign affairs. And we're seeing this more clearly than ever in the last few weeks. But I also think they're going to fail. And I think we all owe a debt to the people of Minneapolis, who have shown a lot of steadfastness in sticking up and fighting back against this fascism. I continue to hope and expect that we will continue to see that from Americans. So I think as much as Trump and his people are lawless, they are criminals, they are fascists, I do not think they are going to succeed in imposing that regime on us.
Well, I thank you very much for joining us here today, Benjamin Carter Hett.
All right, Ian, it's a pleasure to talk to you as always.
And I've been speaking with Benjamin Carter Hett, the professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's the author of Burning the Reichstag, Crossing Hitler, Death in the Tiergarten, and The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic, How Hitler Took the World to War. And his latest book is The Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, The Power of Grievance, What History Reveals About Authoritarianism's Animating Force. We're going to take a B-station break. We're back assessing the possibility of a renewed U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran now that the so-called Armada Trump sent to the region is in place.
The deputy sheriffs, the soldiers, the governors get paid. And the marshals and cops get the same. But the poor white man's used in the hands of them all like a tool. He's taught in his school from the start by the rule that the laws are with him to protect his white skin, to keep up his hate, so he never thinks straight about the shape that he's in.
And joining us now is Nicholas Heras, who is a Senior Director for Strategy and Innovation at the New Lines Institute and the former Middle East Security Program Manager at the Institute for the Study of War, where he was Director of Governmental Relations responsible for Russia and Eurasia. From 2016 to 2017, Nicholas served as the 10th First Lieutenant Andrew J. Bashevich Jr., USA Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he's conducted an extensive study on Iran's proxies in the Middle East for the National Defense University. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nicholas Heras.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Nick. And obviously the Armada, as Trump described it, including the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln and several destroyers, are in position now, as far as we know, from what Southern Command considers the area from which it would strike Iran. Over the weekend, the head of Southern Command met with his Israeli counterpart in Israel, and there's a certain fear or concern or expectation that another joint U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran is about to happen. What do you think?
You know, the Trump administration is navigating sort of treacherous waters here. And fundamentally, we can tell that President Trump and his senior advisors are shaken by the horrific numbers that are coming out of Iran related to the number of protesters that may have been killed in recent protests against the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. And President Trump had made continued repression of the Iranian people one of his red lines in his dialogue, if you will, public statements with the Iranians. But also there's this other factor here, Ian, which is that I get the sense that President Trump is impatient with Iran's leadership as it applies to Iran's nuclear program, and that President Trump is known for dynamic negotiating tactics and amassing strike capabilities in the Middle East theater is one way for President Trump to send a very loud signal to the Iranian leadership that it might be time for them to come to a long-term agreement with the United States. So I read it from that perspective as a type of, we'll say, a forward-leaning diplomatic tactic.
So is there a possibility, though, Nick, that you could have a similar situation that Trump engineered in Venezuela, where you get rid of a very terrible leader, but keep his terrible regime in place? Is there a possibility that you could make a deal with the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, who really are the power? They've got the guns, and they've basically got their fingers in all of the major businesses in Iran, so they have tremendous sway over the economy. Is there a possibility that you could make a deal with the IRGC to get rid of the clerics? Is that anywhere or anywhere near something that's feasible?
I've seen that scenario proposed by serious analysts and observers of Iran, and so we can't discount it. I think one dynamic that is a known unknown is whether or not you could even have the Islamic Republic regime without some sort of strong clerical establishment, or a supreme leader at its head, and whether the entire system will thereby begin to sort of collapse under the weight of itself. More likely than not, you would see as part of this process of negotiating with Iran some sort of movement, I think, related to leveraging Iran's over a year and a half now, almost 2 years now, of sort of a strong dialogue with Saudi Arabia in the Gulf Cooperation Council. So I do think, Ian, regardless of who's at the top of the regime, part of this scenario of, if you will, a U.S. approved continuing Iranian regime type would be very close coordination of that regime type with Saudi Arabia. And for all intents and purposes, agreeing to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and most powerful figure in Saudi Arabia's sort of demands and preferences. And I think looming over everything here, Ian, is the fact that, if Saudi Arabia, via President Trump's negotiating approach, could leverage a long-term deal with Iran, that would go a long way to cementing Saudi Arabia's influence in the Middle East at a time when Saudi Arabia is in a difficult situation with its former partner, now we can say opponent, the United Arab Emirates. So I think from this perspective, Ian, if we look at it from the perspective of what is President Trump trying to get here, if he's trying to get a grand bargain, the best deal of the century, he's very close to the Saudi official, Saudi Arabia. He's very close to Qatar, both of whom are more aligned. In Qatar's case, very much exposed, Qatar is, as is Saudi Arabia, to a potential conflict with Iran. I would see this grand bargain as part of sort of a new Gulf order in which the Saudis and the Iranians put their differences as much as possible to the side and agree to some sort of long-term deal to stabilize the region.
Well, given the extent to which Trump needs his ego stroked, could this be associated with his long desire to get a Nobel Peace Prize and his long campaign against Obama for what he considered the worst deal ever, which was the JCPOA, which Trump has made clear that he'll do a lot better? So could this be it, the deal of the century?
It's possible, Ian. I think President Trump definitely had strong disagreements with the JCPOA and the approach that former President Obama's team took in negotiating the JCPOA. I would also sort of emphasize here that although President Trump in both of his administrations has not shied away from military action, fundamentally, we're talking about a president who has deep suspicion about long-term U.S. military adventures abroad. And this was one of the sort of formative experiences for President Trump in the 2000s and part of his pitch, if you will, in the 2010s as he became a much more well-known political figure in the United States. And I would say that for all the scenario building that analysts may be developing, one very important dynamic here is that there is an aversion, the very top of the U.S. government, to a long-term sort of military scenario in the Gulf that could drive, oil prices sky high at a time when there's already deep concern in the United States about pesky inflation, economic weakness. So I would say that ultimately here, the question is there any type of trigger for the United States to be involved in a military operation that would be anything more than if you will, a powerful statement toward trying to push the Iranian government towards some sort of deal? And if we see the conditions by which the sort of Islamic Republic regime in Iran would begin to sort of deteriorate, then, Ian, there's another question that we all have to follow closely, which is, what is the Israeli approach? Because we know that there are disagreements between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump. Yes, they are allies in many things, but we've seen much more in this administration, in this sort of second term for President Trump, of just public airing of disagreements with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. I think that's that's a dynamic that we will have to follow closely, because from everything we hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition partners, they would like the United States to take a far more aggressive approach toward Iran and potentially create the conditions whereby the Islamic regime system begins to sort of collapse at different places, in which it would lead to a longer term sort of, unmooring of the regime and the elimination of that potential threat to Israel.
So what do you think's happening inside of Iran in terms of the opposition? They've been really bloodied by this brutal crackdown by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, who brought in apparently its murderous partners, the Lebanese Hezbollah and Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, to murder their citizens. At least 5,000 were brutally murdered. And it looks as if that really did end the uprising, because people simply couldn't. You can't expect people to go out and face murderous sniper fire. I mean, at what point has this opposition either one, gone underground, or two, just basically licking their wounds and feeling defeated?
This is a very difficult question from all the perspectives that you've laid out, which is you have here a genuine movement of people within Iran who are calling for reforms in the system, and if not for reforms, just major changes. And of course, we now have a lot of evidence that the regime in Iran has is trying to shoot its way out of this crisis. And I think one of the dynamics that sometimes is overlooked is that the Islamic Republic regime in Iran has essentially, since its inception, had developed various different means to put down armed insurgencies, nonviolent protest movements, sometimes a combination of the two at once. And really, there is a policy debate here that I think that can be had, which is if the goal of any military action in the Middle East against Iran is to create the conditions for the regime to either to change or to soften its approach to internal reform, can you do that with the same actors in place? Because you're talking about a regime of millions of. The regime itself has millions of people, the various different security forces, leadership, etc. There's a very difficult structure to replace. Even if there was no foreign invasion, a la what we saw in Iraq, the question then becomes, what's your alternative? And we've seen different approaches to that. So I think fundamentally for the opposition, I do think the opposition is, from what we have in terms of evidence, the opposition is just trying to sort of regroup, take a pause, and really assess whether or not there are meaningful changes that can be made with past approaches. And that, Ian, then therefore takes us to another potential scenario, which is, are there regional dynamics around Iran that could potentially lead to an armed uprising in various different places, whether it's in Iranian Kurdistan, which has seen a very repressive state response to protest movements, Baluchistan, which has also had similar responses. Would you see potentially a situation in Iranian Azerbaijan that could be potentially triggered by Israel in cooperation with Azerbaijan? Because fundamentally, every peaceful protest movement in recent memory that has tried to push for reform and changes in the regime has been crushed. And so if there isn't going to be a change in approach from the regime at the top and its various different security services, then you have policy advocates that will say, well, maybe there should be a new approach to try to give the Iranian people a help and push forward to try to change or topple the regime.
Well, the Israelis have really penetrated Iran's security service and presumably the military as well. They obviously would like to peel off the military as a way to hedge against the IRGC. I don't think there's no way you can change the IRGC. They're just ruthless fanatics. And the clerical regime is deeply unpopular. The son of Khamenei, Mustafa, is deeply unpopular. Apparently the family have squirreled away something like $60 billion into some foundation that they have. So I could see a cynical move here, getting rid of the clerics and then ending up with the IRGC thugs who already control most of the economy. So this could actually get worse, right? I mean, in a way, we don't know where Venezuela's going to go because the same bunch of crooks are in power there.
Ian, you're right to be skeptical of whether the situation could improve. If you will, the feedback loop that the Islamic Republic regime has is that if it acts with force, it will achieve its objectives, which is regime survival. And this has always been in the policy dilemma that the U.S. has faced when it comes to the Islamic Republic regime in Iran, is that it's a survivor regime. And it's a regime that has multiple different methods of crushing local uprisings or opposition to it. And this type of regime is not one that reforms easily, right? Fundamentally, as much as there is a strong pragmatic streak with the pragmatic element within the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime sort of approach to international politics, and we've seen that pragmatic approach in different circumstances, it's fundamentally still an ideological regime at its heart, and it's still fundamentally a Mahdist regime, believing it can bring about the Messiah. And so there is this dynamic there where even if you were to, let's say, replace the clerical elite as the top of the pyramid and move them more into an advisory kind of role, and as you pointed out, you still have the IRGC core deep state there. In some ways, the situation could be worse, Ian, and you could, in some ways, have a situation where now you go to not just a police state, but an aggressive, murderous police state on top of that. And we have evidence now at the latest uprising this month in Iran that the murderous tendencies of the regime are coming more to the fore, and that is a scary scenario for not just the Iranian people who want change and reform, but also for policymakers outside of Iran who genuinely want to help the Iranian people and are being presented with fewer and fewer options to do that.
Well, Nicholas Heras, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian, as always.
And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.